Joining us here in the beginning of the 4 o'clock hour, Senator Tom Cotton is with us from Washington, D.C. Good to have him along with us. And, hey, Tom, can I ask you that you start, Senator, talking about Brussels, Paris, and everything else that's going on in Europe right now?
Hey, Dave, it's great to be on with you. Hope you're staying dry. Hope all your listeners are safe out there. Dave, the war on terror continues, and unfortunately we are losing. Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and other radical terrorist groups clearly have the continued desire and increasingly the capability to kill Americans, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Europe. And it's not just Americans and Europeans. It's anyone who doesn't submit to their radical ideology. In Pakistan over the weekend, Islamic terrorists went into a park where young Christian families were celebrating Easter and blew them to pieces because they want to kill anyone who doesn't submit to their depraved, evil view of the world. If you look at what's happening in Iraq and Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, they continue to gain more territory from which they can plan and launch attacks. And they've launched increasingly complex attacks from Paris to San Bernardino and now Brussels. It's a real risk for Europe, and it's a risk for the United States as well. And I would just say to all your listeners, in thinking about what we should do, you should ask yourself a simple question. If a Paris or Brussels-style attack occurred in Little Rock, what would you do? What would you want your government to do in response? And whatever it is, we should do that right now before that attack happens to prevent it from happening.
Well, I read these articles about Paris and Brussels. The guy that got out of Paris, and he goes back to Brussels, and he goes back to an area that they willingly acknowledge is areas of jihadist hotbed activity. You look at the Pakistan attacks, and the president says that in Punjab, they wanted to go in and go after areas where they've got real problems with jihadist activity. Why does it take a bunch of people getting killed before we take care of these things?
Well, Dave, it certainly shouldn't. And that's why I say Americans should think about what we would do after one of these attacks and do it to stop one of these attacks. I just came from several town halls today across the state, and many people ask, can this happen here? The answer is yes, of course it can happen here. Now, we do have advantages, not just the obvious advantage that we're separated by the Atlantic Ocean from the refugee and migrant flows from places like Syria and Eritrea and Libya. Also by the fact that our military, our intelligence, and our law enforcement professionals are the most skilled and capable in the world. And we've done the very best job in the world of integrating immigrants of all kinds from all lands into our way of life. And that includes Muslim immigrants. So in America, the Muslim community is actually one of the best sources for tips and leads because they have a good relationship with law enforcement at the local level and the FBI and so forth. Whereas in Europe, they have an almost completely estranged relationship. And therefore, you have the situation that occurred in Brussels where Salah Abdeslam, the most wanted man in Europe for 4 months, was hiding out in his childhood neighborhood. I mean, clearly, the Belgian services have lots of problems. Lots of problems on basic law enforcement, lots of problems on intelligence operations. And we're lucky that we don't have similar problems in this country, but that doesn't mean that we can succeed by playing defense in the war on terror. You have to play offense. You have to go kill and capture the terrorists where they are before they get to the United States.
And that, Senator Cruz came out the other day and he was talking about you put your resources where the problems are, and you would have thought he said we needed to drop a neutron bomb on terrorists. I mean, what do people think we're supposed to do? You want to stop these attacks before they happen, not after they've occurred.
Yeah, and Dave, I can tell you that working with senior FBI officials, which I do on the Intelligence Committee, they have told me that some of the best leads that they get to stop the very kind of radicalization that we have seen in Europe is from Muslim Americans, from community leaders, from family members. Sometimes it's concrete leads to say, hey, my child or my nephew, my brother has left our community and he's gone to Syria or he's gone to Iraq. And that's been a very fruitful and cooperative relationship. And that's, again, because of the American creed and the way we do a good job of integrating and assimilating immigrants of all kinds. That's a great strength of our country. We shouldn't lose that strength, and we should ensure that it continues.
Our guest, Senator Tom Cotton. Senator, my thanks personally for Congress finally pushing the president and the Secretary of State, especially Kerry, to admit that genocide has been going on over in Syria and northern Iraq, and thanks to the Religious Persecution Relief Act to protect Syrian religious minorities as well. Why did this take so long with this administration?
Dave, I'm glad that Secretary Kerry called the genocide that's happening against Christians and other minorities in Iraq and Syria what it is. I think it took longer than it should have because they didn't want to admit the obvious failures of their Syria policy in particular, their Middle East policy in general. But there can be no doubt that religious minorities, in particular Christians, have been singled out for discrimination, persecution, and ultimately extermination. And I wrote and introduced the Religious Persecution Relief Act to address this very problem. Christians, like many minorities, prefer not to work through the United Nations refugee process. Not because the United Nations is ham-handed in the way they process refugees, but because Christians, which are minorities in these lands, have an understandable reluctance to go through an agency other than the United States for fear of being identified and persecuted. And also because they fear persecution in the very refugee camps that have been set up in places like Turkey by their fellow non-Christian refugees. So what my proposal will do is create a special pathway for Christians and other persecuted minorities, like we did for Jews in the Soviet Union, for instance, so they don't have to go through the United Nations, so they can come straight to the State Department and seek refuge in our country. Now, I know your listeners are probably concerned about the security screening that we can do for these refugees, as they should be. So there's a couple points to make there. First, any Christian, any Yazidi, any Jew who's facing religious persecution would undergo the exact same kind of security screening that any other potential refugee would. And second, it's oftentimes easier to identify and safely screen members of small persecuted religious minorities than it is a population at large. Why is that? Because what happens frequently is entire communities are displaced. So if you can imagine a town, say the size of Dardanelle where I live, that's been ethnically cleansed in Syria, it's not just a lone individual who walks in and seeks relief. It's the town leaders, it's the functional equivalent of the mayor, the city council, and so forth, and the religious leaders. So we, as a government, our diplomats and others, can go to those community leaders. They can go to the religious leaders and say, hey, is Dave who he says he is? And you can easily identify him. So there's actually more background screening when you're dealing with religious minorities in many cases than with dealing with just isolated individuals.
Well, I just want to thank you for that piece of legislation. It was an absolutely necessary piece to be written and to be voted on, and we really do appreciate what you did there. Last question for you, because we're running out of time. Talk a little bit about Clean Line and where are we on that?
So Dave, a lot of your listeners probably know Clean Line is a project that would transmit wind power from the Great Plains to the Tennessee Valley Authority. There'd be a little bit of a off-ramp in Arkansas, but the bigger issue is the impact on property owners in Arkansas. The Arkansas Public Service Commission specifically declined this application a few years ago, and now the Department of Energy has approved the exact same application. We don't think that's right. We have a history in this country of approving these kind of projects at the local level and the state level, not the federal level. Mm-hmm. So I've introduced legislation with Senator Bozeman that would require input of the state government before a project like this can move forward under the Department of Energy's authority. Furthermore, we're going to hold the department's feet to the fire to make sure that every I is dotted, every T is crossed, and if it's still open in January of next year with a new president, we're going to try to revisit this decision.
All right. I appreciate your time, Senator. Thanks so much for giving us about 10 minutes to talk about some major issues that people I know have a lot of questions about. We look forward to having you on again in the near future.
All right. Thanks very much.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye now.